Up a little bit. There you go. Yeah, there you go. Perfect. That makes it a little bit more intimate and relatable.
So now we're intimate and relatable.
Exactly.
And I'm glad that we're here to talk about generational politics, but I'm a little concerned about you.
Why? Why, Doug?
The whole idea here with us doing this show together was that we're kind of the same. We're the same politically, and we live in the same city.
Yeah.
But also we're of the same generation.
This is true.
But I'm feeling now like maybe we're not.
Really?
We're not in the same generation.
We're both proud Gen Xers.
Yeah, right. But no, I'm a Gen Xer. I don't know what you are. You haven't read Gen X?
No.
By Douglas Coupland?
I have not.
You've never seen the movie Slacker?
No, I have not seen the movie Slacker.
You're not a fan of the music of Beck?
No, ew,
All the things that define the 90s and being, clued in as a member of Generation X, you've never experienced.
Yes, but I've experienced many other
But look,
things.
Slacker is actually on YouTube.
Oh, okay. Well, then
Slacker
that's great.
is available right now
On YouTube.
on YouTube. No, wait a minute, Mary. That's not Slacker.
No, it's not. What is it?
We live in a society.
These days, we think of childhood as a specific category of life, as a thing. And of course, it is a thing if you consider it from a purely physical standpoint. There is an inherent reality to the stages of life as they are biologically defined. There's an age at which a human is able to begin to reproduce, the time preceding which is called childhood, and an age at which a human's reproductive capacity ends, the time after which is called the golden years, or alternatively complete fucking irrelevance. In the modern era, however, the definition of childhood came to be defined more by social factors than biological ones. Specifically, when an individual could participate in the legal structure of a society and contribute to its productivity. Today, the concept of youth, and especially the evolution of the idea of a specific liminal category between youth and adulthood called, quote, the teenager, is very much tied to the individual's position as a resource in society, specifically as a worker, and the individual's legal rights, their right to drink alcohol, or have sex, or purchase pornography, or watch violent movies, or kill other people under the aegis of national interests, are also intimately connected to their existence as a useful commodity. In pre-industrial societies, of course, there wasn't really a concept of childhood in the modern sense. An individual, of whatever age, participated in activities as soon as he or she was competent to do so. With the onset of the Industrial Revolution, however, the question of who should be grist for Blake's, quote, dark satanic mills became increasingly important. As in pre-industrial societies, children were expected to contribute to their family's survival, but in an industrial context, this took on a vastly different significance. A survey of 982 mills in England and Scotland in 1835 indicated that 43% of the workforce was under 18. The Factory Acts, passed in the UK in the 19th century, aimed to improve this dismal picture. Children younger than 9 were not allowed to work at all, and children from 9 to 16 could only work 16 hours a day. By 1901, the age at which children were allowed to enter the labor force was raised to 12. Contemporary justifications for child labor didn't just center around putting bread on the family's table, but also in a perceived social benefit. In a survey of factory managers in 1833, one respondent said, quote, "When children are not sent to work early, they get into bad company and idle habits which they seldom get rid of." So, how to keep these kids on the straight and narrow when it was determined that working them 16 hours a day began to seem a bit much? compulsory education, of course. And with the rise of compulsory education came the segmentation of young people into ages and classes, one important foundational element that led directly to our modern concept of the teen. Now, it's important to note that using the term teen to refer to the ages between 13 and 19 isn't particularly modern. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the term has been used since the 17th century, along with variants like teener, teening, teenhood, and teenish that never gained traction for some bizarre reason. The first modern use of teenager, deployed with a fussy little hyphen in the middle, was in 1936 in a review of the book Adolescence by G. Stanley Hall. In that book, Hall, the 72nd most cited psychologist of the 20th century, a proponent of racial eugenics and a firm believer in selective breeding and forced sterilization for undesirables, evocatively described the pubescent period as one of, quote, storm and stress. The term teenager, still two words, but now minus the hyphen, took off in 1945 when the New York Times published a Teenage Bill of Rights by one Elliot E. Cohen, a 10-point manifesto which begins, quote, "In the current debate over teenagers, the pendulum has swung between what is wrong with our children and what is wrong with us. One result is that the average parent finds himself bewildered. To help end the confusion, a group of experts recently met to plan a series of studies and papers based on the lengthy experience of the agency. Out of the board's discussion came the effort to put down 10 simple points covering the young people's rights." These 10 points included things like the right to let childhood be forgotten, the right to make mistakes, and the right to question ideas. Read today, one can't help but suspect the piece was written less for teens than for their parents. It was, after all, the era of post-war boom. The Depression was over, the war was over, and there were plenty of good-paying jobs to go around. More importantly, in such an environment, the role children played, both socially and imaginally, changed. They changed, I would argue, into the avatars of their parents' fantasies of escape and freedom from responsibility. Fantasies which would only grow stronger and more urgent as the restriction and conformity of the 50s took hold. With increasing restriction and conformity came a corresponding need to imagine someone as free. Parents placed their children into this imaginal space, empowering them in ways that were almost purely symbolic. Teenagers are marketed too because they are given money by parents who desire the feeling of experiencing vicariously a position of being catered to. We, as a society, came to focus on them both because they were an important component of the post-war consumer society and also because they came to fill an emotional void that modern capitalism created. They don't know it. It doesn't have any relevance for them.
Clearly isn't actually a Zoomer song.
It's a Zoomer song because the word Zoom is in it.
That's some bad logic there. You talk to Ben Burgess.
That I was born right in between. Like, if I'm a millennial, I'm the very last millennial. I was born in 1996. So whether or not I'm a millennial or not, it just depends on where you draw the line. And people draw it anywhere from like 1993 to 2000. My experience growing up was, I mean, I think it was different than his. I don't really remember 9/11 very well. I do remember the 2008 crash. You know, I remember having dial-up. When I was 16, I didn't have a smartphone. He does have a smartphone and he's 14.
When you guys were 14, did you know anyone who would wear a hat like that out in public?
Yeah, probably.
I grew up in a conservative, I grew up in a fairly small town, so I probably didn't think about it.
When I was his age, I had male friends who painted their nails and wore silly hats or whatever.
You would get beaten up, probably. Welcome to Medford. When I was like 6 years old, I saw Nazis getting their photo taken at a Walmart, like all dressed up, a Nazi couple.
What?
And I don't think you'd see that here.
They have like the swastika on their arm?
Full military uniform.
Wow, that's something.
I think that we're not going to be able to solve climate change, and the population will drop a lot, and eventually we won't be able to survive. The last of us will probably just be living on little boats, honestly.
It'll be like Waterworld.
When most Americans think about the history of student activism, the swinging 60s immediately spring to mind in all their plastic fantastic glory.
Webster defines the word now as meaning at the moment or at once. Seldom has a nation been able to witness such an explosion, a new mass mind, a nowness as it...
The reality is probably that student activism has been around for as long as students have been around. But what it means to be a student today, or back in 1968, is profoundly different than what it meant to be a student in ancient Athens or in the 13th century. In order to understand how student life and student activism has changed, let's start there, in the 13th century. According to Mark Edelman, in his book, Student Resistance, A History of the Unruly Subject, student protesters in the past were, quote, much like university students today, as they, quote, felt neither personal nor social pressures to conform to their foster town's notions of proper behavior or proper respect for person or property. Still, in order to discover how student activism has changed through history, we'll have to take a look at what those notions around proper behavior and authority were, and just what material and political circumstances shaped those norms and systems of authority and power. When students in Bologna organized that university as a guild, the university system was changing due to the recovery of ancient Roman texts discovered due to the Crusades. As scholars set to work reabsorbing previously lost ancient texts, often traveling to Spain to learn Arabic, they set up cathedral schools in Italy. The students in these schools were often foreigners, and some form of collectivization became necessary to protect the student body from discriminatory taxation and price gouging. The student protest that arose from the unfair treatment of foreigners was instrumental in the formation of the university system itself, as the word universitas itself means guild. Reading over the history of the beginning of the university system, it's clear that the students organized due to their common interests as foreigners in a strange land, and their common ambition to obtain an education in order to advance socially in the aristocracy or priesthood, and not in order to transform society. Society was transformed nonetheless, however. During the Enlightenment, the number of public and private schools rose dramatically, and society changed so that even the poor sought access to education. By the 1700s, charity schools teaching various trades began opening in large numbers. The emergence of these kinds of schools at the dawning of the era of capitalism is no coincidence. In England, the enclosure movement a century earlier had pushed peasants off their land and into the cities where the new working classes and their children worked in slave-like conditions for low wages. The resulting massive poverty brought with it various remedies, including Elizabethan poor laws and charity schools meant to bring both order to the cities and aid to the poor. One of the unintended consequences of the charity schools was that they brought young working-class people together in a highly charged political environment, and often united them with a common purpose. The history of the political aims of student movements mirrors the political history of the development of capitalism. And it goes on, from Russia to Argentina to China to Tokyo to Latin America, West Africa, France, and the United States. As capitalism spread, the inner contradictions and unintended consequences spread as well. Efforts to educate and integrate the young into society came with the risk of heightened political awareness and even radicalization. Still, the political character of these student movements was far from uniform, just as the broader political movements that sprang from the contradictions within capitalism were also variable. Far from being a reliable mechanism for the creation of socialist youths, the student movements historically have been driven both by elite and working class interests, and have included nationalist movements of liberation against foreign powers, anti-Semitic movements associated with Nazism, countercultural movements, as well as socialist movements with radical demands. Student movements have never been entirely independent. The interests of student activists are always tied to the economic and political conditions of their time. And just as the concept of the teenager is a relatively recent cultural development, The notion that students are a homogeneous class of their own, that students have a transhistorical revolutionary potential based on their youth alone, is a relatively new and quite erroneous idea.
I'm organizing the youth, Doug!
All right, well, Mary, we're not an anarchist channel.
Oh, okay.
This is a Marxist channel.
Oh, all right, well,
and I don't believe in your bourgeois ideology.
Doug, anarchism's important to me!
When Doug and I were talking about this episode and about generational politics, the conversation drifted, as one might expect, to the forms our political activism took during our own personal college years. I'm of an advanced age now, teetering on the brink of senility, and I honestly couldn't quite remember. I considered myself either a goth or a punk, depending on which end of the bipolar spectrum I happened to be rocking that week or day or hour. Whether I felt like moping mournfully or stomping around aggressively, I could do it in the same black wardrobe and cheap Wet n Wild eyeliner. I know for a fact I owned a 1966 Dodge A100 van, which was a rolling junk heap and overheated constantly. As it was inherited from my parents, I, of course, felt the need to express my dominion over it by taking a rattle can of black spray paint and adorning it with anarchy symbols. It also had an 8-track tape player. I only owned 2 8-track tapes, Oxygene by Jean-Michel Jarre, and some off-brand Kmart greatest polka hits tape that I pulled out of some bin somewhere. These were the tapes I blasted out of the anarchy van during my time as an English and film major at the University of Oregon in Eugene between the years of 1986 and 1990, as I drove it through the streets and on one notable occasion through the breezeway of the Herb Memorial Student Union. But was any of this shenaniganry political? Was I striving for some higher organizational purpose? I wish I could say it was. I really do. But revisiting the truth of my youthful self is as little comfort to my aging self as a glimpse of my aging self would have been horrifying to me at 20. All the images and symbols I adopted during that time were just that, images, a pose. The one interesting thing that strikes me, and that I think relates directly to generational politics and specifically my and Doug's position as Gen Xers, is that it was a self-conscious pose. I knew I was posing, that I was actively performing. I had the feeling, quite deeply ingrained, this was somehow required or expected of me, not to perform in a way that was pleasing to anyone else, certainly not my parents. Transgressing against what was pleasing to them was kind of the whole point, but rather to perform in a way that was interesting, noteworthy, and unexpected. TV had taught me that this was the highest value I could pursue. What was the point of doing anything unless it was interesting enough to be televised? If I could just be weird enough or outlandish enough, then I would be worthy of note. So while I was experiencing my desire to enact the models that were being presented to me, I was also simultaneously deconstructing that desire, staring under the hood at the cultural, political, and social factors that went into them, just like I had to stare under the overheated engine cowl of my junker Dodge just about every time I made the long, hot, loud, rattling trip up I-5 to Portland from Eugene, with Jarre's popcorn cranked up as high as it could go, in search of some place not where I could be real, but where I could perform. All this fakery, and also the fact that I was aware of the fakery and my participation in it, made me angry and uncomfortable. That's where the drugs came in handy, and yeah, you can't talk about Gen X or any generation really without getting to the drugs. For me, not only were they authentic and raw, actually subversive, not just performatively so, but their pharmacological mediation allowed me to sometimes forget that I was just pretending to be a, quote, media-worthy character, and actually feel like I was media-worthy, like I was actually inhabiting the role I felt I was supposed to play. None of this has much to do with anarchism, not Noam Chomsky anarchism. I was a poser, and I still am, but it was the dream that I inherited.
All right, Mary, so thank you for sitting lower than me.
Yeah.
You're about 6'5", right? And I'm 4'2". So.
Well, and this is significantly lower too, so yeah. Okay, so why are we here, Doug, and what are we doing?
Well, behind us is the house that an old haunt of ours used to be attached to, called the Telecafe.
Yes.
Where'd I put my cup?
Hold on, let me get your cup for you.
Thank you, Mary, for fetching with my coffee.
Mine's empty though, but that's okay. You don't have to know that. That is delicious coffee.
So Mary, behind us is the house that's now, what is it, the alumni house?
It's the alumni house, yes. It's where all the alumni have their functions.
Right, but we used to go here when there was a building attached to it called the Telecafe.
Yes, and it was a wreck. It was a rundown shell of a building. It's the Simon Benson House, which is a historical house built by a timber baron.
Really?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, I remember it was a house where like meth addicts used to hide in the basement. And it was not here, it was just a few blocks down that way.
Right, because they moved it because they tore down like that whole block to build condos here in Portland, which maybe you've heard. They built a few condos.
Yep,
here
I remember that.
Yeah.
I've heard about that happening. I try to shield my eyes from it.
Yeah, you should.
But but we used to hang out at the Telecafe.
Yep. And it was called the Telecafe. Why? Explain to our viewers why.
Well, because back then it was very exciting for there to be telephone access available to all the patrons. There was a telephone on every table.
Yes, and they were the old school telephones, the rotary dial ones.
Some of them, but the main thing was there was only one phone line.
Oh, so it was like a party line?
It was just like if you had a bunch of phones in your house.
Yeah,
but a party line is like when you would have to share the same phone line with a number of different people.
Oh, I see what you're saying, like in an apartment or something, and you'd pick it up and Mrs.
And
Smith
you would have a different number,
4G.
but you were really sharing the same line. So every once in a while you could just listen in on someone else's call back in the 70s.
But regardless, this was not a party line.
No, it was not. It was just one line, but so if someone's on the phone, you had to wait, even if they're across the room at a different table.
But you could pick it up and listen to their conversation, couldn't you?
They could see you doing it.
That would be kind of cool, though.
But you used to hang out at the Telecafe, too.
I did, but the Telecafe was not my main cafe hangout in Portland.
Yeah, because I don't remember you from there.
No, my main cafe hangout was the Cafe Omega and Jiffy Squid.
I think I had my very first, steamed milk drink at the Cafe Omega at 2 o'clock in the morning and hung out with a homeless poet in 1991.
That's probably my ex-husband.
Well,
you can cut that out.
In his book, Millennials and the Moments That Made Us, the Zero Book's author, Sean Scott, explains the 1990s, and specifically the left in the 90s, by referring to Pierre Dardot's notion of the neoliberal subject. Quoting Dardot, he wrote, "The reinvention of left-wing politics in the 1990s was only the most striking example of the domination of the new neoliberal rationality." Understanding this might get us part of the way towards answering the question I want to put to you. Why was anarchism the most popular radical left opposition movement, or at least pose, for young people in the 90s? And at the start here, I'll offer 4 answers to that. Generation X grew up during the Cold War and witnessed its end as young adults. The Marxist left had splintered into humorless sectarian cults decades earlier. Marxism didn't seem to address concerns about the environment, and the neoliberal turn created conditions of hyper-individualism. Most members of the cohort called Generation X considered the Soviet experiment to have been a failure. Rather than overcoming national and class divisions, the Soviet Union had developed its own imperial project, had locked in its citizens and had entered a seemingly suicidal nuclear arms race with the admittedly deranged West. What Gen X no longer trusted or believed in was any universalist project to logically and rationally administer a united and coordinated world. I want to suggest that we lost faith in this universalist project because the Soviet Union had failed, rather than the Russian Revolution culminating with the seizure of power by the working class, rather than transforming the productive mode of life so that our collective work better served our needs and itself became the source of our own liberation. The revolution had led to the development of a state bureaucracy, and some would say a form of state capitalism. When the Russian Revolution was won, the main project for the Bolshevik Party was to socialize the means of production. In Chapter 1 of The Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky writes, quote, "Socialization of the means of production had become a necessary condition for bringing the country out of barbarism. That is, the law of combined development for backward countries applied." Lenin wrote that entering upon the socialist revolution as the weakest link in the capitalist chain, the former empire of the czars is even now, in the 19th year after the revolution, still confronted with the task of catching up with Europe and America. She has, that is, to solve those problems of technique and productivity which were long ago solved by capitalism in the advanced countries. End quote. In order to understand why this is an admission that the Soviet Union was state capitalist, one only has to understand that by socialization of the means of production, Trotsky meant that the land and other means of production had to be seized so that the working class could be developed. That is, the aim was to create a capitalist society wherein everyone is in a state of interdependence. Socialization means moving away from work done for yourself and for your own consumption. It is a stamping out or the withering away of subsistence farming. Once this failure of the Soviet Union could no longer be denied, and it certainly couldn't be denied after the USSR's collapse in 1991, the idea of a united and rationally administered world became synonymous with state violence. The world was turned upside down, and barbarism began to seem less barbaric than civilization. But what about the West? That is, what about the neoliberal turn that Sean Scott and Dardeau focused their attention on? The project of neoliberalism is, in its essence, an administrative project that aims not to unite and rationally administer the coordination of people around the world, but is instead aimed at overcoming various problems that are born out of allowing the logic of commodity production and capital accumulation to coordinate the people of the world for us. The neoliberal turn is most easily grasped, then, as a turn away from state-centered efforts to coordinate and regulate capitalist production and distribution, towards efforts to either get the state out of the way of capital, or if not, then to use state power in direct service to capital, rather than as a moderating influence against the excesses and inequality capitalist production and distribution inevitably brings about. In his essay, Critique of Historical Transformation, the Marxist critical theorist Moishe Pastone wrote, "Inasmuch as this trajectory of state-centric capitalism encompasses both Western capitalist countries and the Soviet Union, it very strongly suggests that Soviet socialism should be regarded as a failed variant regime of capitalist accumulation, rather than as an organization of society that represented the overcoming of capitalism, however flawed that organization may have been." This, arguably, is the case not only because, as some have noted, the Soviet Union also rested upon the exploitation of the working class, but also because the rise and fall of the Soviet Union can be seen retrospectively as having been very much part of the temporal structuring and restructuring of capitalism in the 20th century. One of the consequences of Pastone's argument is that the reason anarchism was the most popular form of radical opposition to capitalism around in the 90s was because, rather than the left forming a radical project capable of overcoming capitalism, it had instead been led by capital just as much as any advertising campaign, bourgeois political party, or CEOs led by capital. After all, in retrospect, 90s anarchism amounted to the embrace of various lifestyles, or more accurately, to modifications to personal consumption, or to various kinds of activism in service of either neoliberal or social democratic left parties. What those of us who want to be on the radical left are faced with is the prospect of starting over without knowing in advance that we're on the right side of history, or that we already have the answers to our problems secreted away somewhere. The task is not to discover who we really are. It's not to be true to ourselves as we find ourselves, but to step away from our received dreams and identities and risk being, for now, not Zoomers, not Millennials, not members of Generation X or the baby boom, but nothing at all.
We were talking about what albums meant something to us when we were in college. This one right here, Wire. This wall, I'm just saying, this wall to me looks like an old school record store wall. I listen to Duran Duran and Adam Ant.
Duran Duran. Yeah, I see your chick.
Shut up! Hey, a lot of guys like Duran Duran.
Yeah, gay guys.
Oh no.
The odd thing about my generation, about Generation X, is that we were a rerun. The original group to be given the label Gen X were a mere handful, a group of 23 people born in 1932. They were the subject of an essay published in Holiday magazine and put together by the photojournalist Robert Capa. Capa named his subjects Generation X because the group, having come of age during World War II, were, as a whole, lost. They had no clear sense of what was expected of them, what the future would hold, or even of what they wanted. The editors of Holiday magazine explained these young people this way. Only one person out of 20 looks back to the past with anything like longing. For most of them, the immediate past, the events of their lifetime, has been too harsh and too cruel to remember with pleasure. And the long past, the heavy, deadening hand of history, is still the great enemy. Some of the young people in this proto-Generation X would have been the older siblings of baby boomers, as this X were a subset of the silent generation. They grew up listening to Frank Sinatra and Lee Brown and his orchestra, and only knew that they wanted individual freedom and a better world than the one they'd experienced so far. 12 years later, the journalist Jane Daverson would apply the label Generation X to the teenagers she interviewed for Women's Own magazine. As recounted on the website for a consumer exploration, brand strategy, and product innovation agency called The Sound, Daverson had been asked to write a nice feature on wonderful British teens and why we should be so proud of them. But after talking to a few of these teens, she ditched the premise and waded knee-deep into the debauchery of the swinging 60s. The article she wrote was rejected by her editors, but became the basis for a book entitled, What Else? Generation X. Again, according to The Sound, neither of these origin stories were much of an influence on the man responsible for labeling my generation as X. Instead, it was Paul Fussel's book, Class, a guide through the American status system, that was a source of inspiration for Douglas Coupland. Fussell described Xers as a group of people that were a self-selecting aristocracy of the talented and clever. According to The Sound, the generation that Coupland saw as a cohort of cynical individuals who, in Randian fashion, wanted out of the bind of society and social obligation, a group who did not want to sacrifice themselves to anyone or anything, were also the first generation whose collective or average prospects were lower than their parents had been. But faced with economic forces that were wreaking havoc on the modern dream of peace and prosperity, the generation whose label and cultural significance had been worked out 40 years earlier mainly turned to various forms of cultural and personal expression as they tried to muster up some form of rebellion. From the start, Generation X was defined as a social class and as a cultural reaction to the problems of modernity or of history. In his upcoming book, Can the Left Learn to Meme?, author Mike Watson notes that, like the original Generation X, my generation had experienced a major disruption. He wrote, "With the fall of the Soviet Union and the birth of George Bush Sr.'s New World Order signaling American hegemony, military conflict became highly mobile, perpetual, and only thinly presaged on any ethical concern. Generation X responded with a pragmatic approach. If the politicians weren't going to do politics conventionally, neither would they." The question for the reboots of Generation X, that is, for millennials and Zoomers, is whether they can develop any coherent politics at all, or whether they will, like the mostly forgotten burnouts from the 90s, remain mired in the misconceptions that created this Whiggish idea of cultural progress accomplished through sexual reproduction. The Marxist contrarian Chris Cutrone is pessimistic. In his essay, The Millennial Left is Dead, he wrote, "All of us must play the hand that history has dealt us. The problem is that the millennial left chose not to play its own hand, shying away in fear from the gamble. Instead, they fell back upon the past, trying to replay the cards dealt to previous generations. They are inevitably suffering the same results of those past failed wagers."
When you look back in the 90s, and especially maybe the early 90s, I just recall there was this movie called Flashback. It came out like I think in 1989. It was with Dennis Hopper and Donald Sutherland's kid, Kiefer Sutherland. Remember him?
Is he still alive?
He's still alive. But Kiefer Sutherland, you remember he was in Flatliners?
Yeah, and he was in that vampire. He was in the Lost Boys.
Lost Boys, and he was in this movie called Flashback with Dennis Hopper, okay? And in the movie, Kiefer Sutherland plays an FBI agent whose task is to transfer old member of the SDS from the 60s, played by Dennis Hopper, on a train from one side of the country to another, or across state lines or something, for trial. And he's like an old, like Weather Underground or SDS member who's a wanted terrorist for having blown up the Pentagon or some shit. Like, I mean, he didn't blow up the Pentagon, but trying to do something that was illegal that had to do with trying to stop the war in Vietnam.
Okay.
Like, I don't remember the details.
Oh, you clearly remember a lot of the detail because
I don't think
that's
I've ever
oddly
seen
specific.
The movie. I think all I ever saw was the trailer.
You got all that from the trailer?
Yeah.
Thank you. Ooh, our onion rings are here.
Ooh, onion rings.
So clearly, you saw the trailer, and from the trailer, you got literally the whole movie.
No, I just got the setup. That was all just the setup, right?
That's a lot.
Dennis Hopper, Kiefer Sutherland.
SDS.
Kiefer. Kiefer Sutherland.
Like the milk drink.
Yeah. The tagline was, it came out in 1989, or maybe 1990, and it said, the tagline was, the 90s are going to make the 60s look like the 50s.
And the 40s are going to make the 80s look like the 30s.
No.
What? This movie was important to you?
No, it wasn't. The trailer was important to me. I never even saw the movie. The 90s are going to make the 60s look like the 50s. You understand what that means?
No, I absolutely don't.
That's a lot of math.
I mean, what do you think the 50s represent?
Like, what is it? Happy Days. Like, you know, sock hops and bebop and like Arnold's Diner. That's the 50s. And the Cold War.
Social conformity.
Okay, yeah. All right, fair enough.
And the 60s represents what?
Revolution. And like, and the Beatles. Right, okay. So the 90s.
We're going to look back from the 90s and say, the 60s were nothing. People were conformist.
Oh, okay.
The 90s are going to break with everything, man. We're going to see the whole society change in the 90s. We're set. After Reagan, we're going to see a whole new universe in the 90s under Bill Clinton.
I don't think that's the way it worked out, though, is it? Okay, well, you drink.
That was such a depressing thing to say. I had
That's
to
really
drink.
depressing.
So anyway, the 90s. That's how I went into the 90s.
Takes more than going down to your local video store and renting Easy Rider to be a rebel.
Dennis Hopper, Kiefer Sutherland, Flashback.
Once we get out of the 80s, the 90s are gonna make the 60s look like the 50s.
Well, what did you think of the movie Slacker?
It was okay.
Because for me, in 1991, that movie was completely transformative.
Wow,
It totally changed my life.
I don't know what to say.
Well, Mary, the thing is that we have to have ideological consistency.
Sure, all right.
And I feel like it was more than just getting involved in cafe culture and reading some Jameson. It really changed my direction.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.